Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the 72nd edition of the 706 podcast, where we, meaning myself, Tony, Connor, and Anthony, my three co-hosts, collectively decide which 706 movies are the greatest of all time, which 706 movies land in our canon that we will be buried with someday. Of course, this process is exploratory, so we will stumble upon movies that are no doubters. We will stumble upon hidden gems, or maybe find cultural monoliths that actually don't live up to the hype, in our opinion. Today, we're discussing a movie which, let's say, is not very ubiquitous in the cultural zeitgeist or online forums, and that is the movie Sphere, 1998's sci-fi horror thriller directed by Barry Levinson, originally adapted from a Michael Crichton novel, I believe of the same name. So let's see, Kurt Wimmer with the adaptation, and then Stephen Hauser with the screenplay, starring a pretty star-studded cast as far as these ensembles go. I mean, we have Dustin Hoffman, we have Sharon Stone, we have Samuel L. Jackson, Liv Schreiber, even a Queen Latifah appearance in there. Pretty interesting. So, yes, let me just run down the basic premise, and then I'll let my co-hosts give their opinions on the film. Essentially, a team of scientists and experts in various fields are called to the Pacific Ocean to investigate an unidentified spacecraft that was found at the bottom of the ocean under 300 years worth of coral, unopened, presumed to be extraterrestrial. And it kind of embarks from there. That most of the movie takes place underwater in these various biomes that are built, these habitats for them, and plays out in a suspenseful way where the crew has contact with what appears to be an alien life form dubbed the Sphere, and a variety of misfortunes befall them afterwards. And the movie kind of details their pursuit to understand what exactly is going on while contacting this entity and trying to gain control of the situation in kind of a classic horror, paranoia infused thriller. So that's basically the premise. Let's go around and we'll go in a certain order. And I want to start with Connor, because Connor was so bold and noble as to choose this film when I nominated it last episode. I do want to preface this. I want to temper your expectations. This film lost approximately 43 million at the box office, throughout its run. It was critically panned, as kind of this cliche, derivative drivel. We will see what our co-hosts have to say. That's maybe I'm trying to set the bar low. Maybe I'm trying to contextualize these opinions that are about to come, but we will see. Is there any diamond in this rough? So go ahead, Connor. Tell us about your experience with Sphere.
Kirk, thank you. I'll say I'm glad I picked it. It was an interesting choice. I think it was the right choice for the podcast. Let's just observe one thing, one curious fact about the Sphere. When one enters the Sphere, however exactly that is done, one has an encounter with the Sphere. After one has entered the Sphere, curiously, one does not remember that one has entered the Sphere. And seemingly also, if one chooses, having gained the Sphere's powers, you can also choose to forget about ever having encountered the Sphere. I'm not sure which it is. If I simply can't remember having entered the Sphere, if I want to forget, if I could choose, if I could just choose to forget about the Sphere, would I? I don't know. But these are the interesting questions that the movie raises. And I found myself a little bit bewildered by it, I must say. I think I would agree with, I think this is just a problem of, what have you seen before, and what does this movie make you think of? And does it introduce a kind of comparison? And obviously critics, I probably disliked it, probably for the reason you could compare it to some other movies. And I think, one movie that I heard in just briefly looking at, critics' takes on this movie was Solaris, which is very cool. And Andrei Tartakovsky's, famous movie and the famous novel, which we also saw treated as a kind of thematic device or thematic kind of touchstone in Adam Curtis's Bitter Lake, this idea of this object that is alien, but really reflects back onto you all of your own, reflects back to you yourself, reflects the self, the other kind of reflects the self. And that's obviously kind of profound idea, and one that I think is, interesting in the context of science fiction, in the context of speculative fiction. I would say that it is, because I had this comparison in mind, there's also another movie that I would mention. Is a very early movie from 1953 called Forbidden Planet, which is kind of a favorite old sci-fi movie of mine. I think I may have recommended it at one point for this podcast, but that also thematizes the idea of an encounter with very powerful alien technology that is itself marred by, humanity's unreadiness, humanity's, technological advancement, but also sort of psychological unreadiness, to encounter the other. And I think these are, cool themes of science fiction, but, somehow I have to take off points, for what I feel is originality, simply because I've seen these stories before, and though they're not told in the same way as Fear is, somehow it loses this impact here. I think my main gripe with it would be this, that temperamentally, I always have a problem with, to use like maybe an overused kind of like critics sort of thing, like, I've heard other people complain about it, the idea of the mystery box, or the idea of the kind of puzzle that needs to be sort of solved throughout a movie, when it's not in the context of like a murder mystery, when it's kind of like there's something otherworldly we're dealing with, and the movie will take its time sort of revealing what the truth about this is, and we're expecting a twist, and so we imagine all kinds of twists, but the movie, I think, in this movie in particular, it's intentionally bewildering as to what, the sort of the sphere ultimately is. It does give us ultimately a rather definitive answer, with some, mystery obviously still remaining, but it engages in like deliberate misdirection. And I found that just a little bit annoying. And also I found that, it sets up rules that it doesn't quite follow. And if you try to like wrestle with the premise, right, that the sphere's main quality is that it manifests, sort of our thoughts. Well, apparently it only manifests the worst thoughts. It doesn't manifest, all kinds of things would manifest in that underwater chamber if it were my thoughts that needed to be manifested. Certainly not only thoughts of snakes and squids and this kind of thing. So yes, Kirk is shaking my head. Yes, that was a sort of a
Sharon Stone is in the movie.
sort of ribald joke, but why not, right? If the unconscious is being projected, why is our unconscious seemingly mostly made up of aquatic creatures? It seems kind of convenient. Anyways, there's all these questions. However, I will say that the movie's favorite has, I think, pretty compelling performances. I think from Dustin Hoffman. I think there's someone who could have said, "Oh, he's phoning it in for this one." Samuel L. Jackson phoning in. I think there's moments, there's scenes where they seem to kind of not be giving their 100%, but I think overall, like, they certainly bring a certain gravitas to this movie and manage to lend a human element. I think it's so important, kind of in the Michael Crichton, formula, right? Having these kind of strong characters who get into these, sci-fi situations. So I thought it was good in that respect. But yeah, ultimately, I didn't respond, to the mystery. I wasn't getting the kind of maybe the metaphorical, allegorical valences. There's more that I could be seeing here, I think. I still feel weird about the whole squid thing. But these are all, unconscious worries that may manifest at a later time.
Right, exactly. It may manifest in this podcast. We don't know if we're safe. Have I been into the sphere, right? That's what Connor,
I think we should make sure we all say whether or not we went in the sphere. I didn't go in. Connor, did you?
I didn't go in the sphere, no.
Okay,
no.
good.
I don't remember.
I don't remember either. So we'll see. Based on how this goes, I will just say that if I had gone in the sphere, you all would have loved this film. So it's very clear that I haven't been in the atmosphere. This is a harsh reality.
This was your
and
fear.
it's not of my choosing. But
This was
what's
your
that?
darkest fear, that someone would not like fear. See, so again, it only seems to manifest the bad thoughts.
Right. Yeah, that is true. Okay. Connor, thank you for, what seemed like a measured and fair critique. Anthony, let's go next because Tony will save for last, having actually read the book that this movie's adapted from. So, Anthony, I'm expecting unpleasantries from you. So let's hear them.
Well, first of all, did Tony actually read the book?
I read the book for this podcast. Yes, for the past week or so.
I thought that was just an ongoing joke I missed or something. Okay, so that's out of the way. Second, I gotta say, I feel like I should say, I'm a little disappointed with Connor's response. First of all, because we're dealing with a movie from 1998, and there was no mention of the end of history, Fukuyama. I wanted that sort of reading. I was waiting for. I had my notepad.
Okay, I'll have to think fast. Go ahead, Tony. Anthony, you can take.
No, it was gone. One thing I will say is interesting about the context, though, actually, in all seriousness, of the late 90s, sort of peak X-Files fame, dealing with aliens. Of course, the same year this movie's released, the X-Files film comes out, and it's actually a pretty big hit for the time. I think it made 180 million for a TV show, enough to, keep the series going past the point that they thought they would end it, which is interesting. All this sort of in the air, aliens, 2 years after Independence Day, 1996, I think. So, of course, you feel all this is kind of in the air, like, this is kind of the thing driving these sort of blockbusters. And it's a sort of, to its credit, somewhat of an original idea. It's based on a book. It's based on Michael Crichton, who's a big success throughout the 90s and, of course, Westworld earlier. But all that's to say is, as I was watching this movie, I think for about an hour and a half, I was actually into, Kirk's already shaking his head. No, I actually thought this was a really good B movie, like really solid for that hour and a half. I think where the movie loses me is getting into a little bit of what Connor was saying, which is the need to explain the sphere, the need to unravel the sort of temporal paradox of the black hole and the time travel, all that sort of thing. The need to kind of settle those answers feels kind of like a cop out to me. It feels too satisfactory, when I think the movie was at its biggest success is when we're just kind of reading these things on the computer, and they're crossing from that like kind of late 90s Windows style desktop to covering the screen in this sort of hell like 2001 moment. But there are moments that aren't necessarily terrifying, but they are thrilling, which is watching the crew struggle to keep this submarine device safe, and everything going wrong. Dustin Hoffman's character freezing up, Liev Schreiber being sucked down and his head kind of being stuck where the flames are rising. The one kind of leader, I can't remember his name, the captain, being stuck halfway in the door and being chopped up. All these things are kind of thrilling. And I love this moment as they're kind of trying to figure out what the hell's going on outside the submarine. And it's this like H.P. Lovecraftian style, like being that they think is coming down on the radar. All that to me was the most interesting part. Where the movie loses me, though, is again after that, when we start getting the idea of the manifestation, when we start getting the idea of the sphere's influence, and a sort of cop out of, it reminded me of The Thing in a way that was less successful. I didn't really care for the sort of calling each other out, the sort of Samuel L. Jackson's character being potentially under the influence, and on and on. So suffice to say, good performances, something of a good movie. I think in the kind of earlier stages of the film that kind of lose it by the third act. And I think what may be the problem, though, I'm curious if Tony will get to this, is maybe that third act works much better on the page. So overall, though, okay movie.
Yeah, fair. I mean, it's all about expectations, truly. I think, right? Like, imagine spending, you're working at Blockbuster, you had a long day, putting back 3 Men and a Baby or something, I don't know, and you couldn't find the damn VHS, and then you go to the theater, you pay $4.50. That's a lot of money. You buy some Twizzlers, buy a popcorn, you put your beeper on silent, and you sit down, you watch Sphere, you come out, your girlfriend's like, man, that was whack. What the heck? And let's go to the mall. And that's the end of your Friday. But it's all about expectations. And this movie obviously didn't live up to critical expectations, nor did it live up to commercial expectations. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't appreciate it for what it is here in the year 2021. But before I go into my perspective, Tony, I would love to hear from you. This is a first. This will get us on YouTube Rewind. The fact that you've read the book of the movie we watched this week. So let's hear it, Tony. Make sure to give us some sound clips.
Yes, I did read Michael Crichton's Sphere in preparation for this episode, sort of as an experiment, which I'm kind of glad I did. It definitely colored my experience of the movie, as reading the book will inevitably do. And this movie was surprisingly faithful to the book. It was pretty close. I think the plot, the overall plot, is extremely similar. And I'd say the first half of the book, or the first half of the movie rather, is more or less beat for beat taken from the book, just kind of sped up on like fast motion. And then the second half, it kind of moves some things around for the sake of consolidating things to very mixed results. But we end up in basically the same place. The one major difference, I will say, and I hope you guys don't care about me spoiling this novel. I don't know if any of you plan on reading it, but the ending of the book implies that Beth has actually retained the power without telling them. Because there's this thing about how like everyone's saying how hot Beth is, like she's getting hotter and hotter, like while they're in the habitat or whatever. And then at the last page of the book, they've all forgotten what's happening. They're like, wow, Beth, you look really good. And then she's like, thank you. And she smiles. And that's the last line of the book. So it's kind of implied that she actually still has the power. That's the big, like, shocking, rug pull or whatever. Anyway, so this movie, I agree with a lot of what was said. I do think the performances were pretty strong. I thought that Dustin Hoffman, I think the protagonist, Norman, is a better character in the movie than he is in the book. In the book, he's extremely flat. I think they make him more of kind of a dick in the movie and much more flawed. The fact that he, engaged in this like unethical behavior, cheating on his wife, sleeping with a patient, the fact that he basically defrauded the federal government, stuff like that, that was not in the book. And I liked that. It gave him some texture. And when he's just like yelling at Beth, and it's like, this guy's an asshole. Like, oh my God. And part of it too was Dustin Hoffman's performance, because he really is like, he didn't have to go as hard as he did. He didn't have to like give it his all in the way he did. I thought Sharon Stone too, like, really gave herself and really gets into the material. It's the way she's crying when she's like, don't you believe me? That felt genuine to me. It felt like, or it came from a real place. And then Samuel L. Jackson, I mean, he's fine. He's no Ordell from Jackie Brown, which was like the previous year. So we know he can act. He just sort of like wasn't feeling this, which is fine. It's a Sphere. I get it. He's more of a cube guy, I bet. So yeah, so this movie, there were things about it I liked. I thought that the visual design of the habitat itself was pretty cool. Like the dining room area, it felt like lifted straight from Alien, actually. It felt very, very reminiscent of Alien, but I liked the kind of the environment. I like this underwater setting. And I agree that the first half does a good job kind of setting up this scenario and deploying these like steady reversals or these like complications, or like it's actually 300 years old and you find the Sphere. And I think that the pacing is pretty good. It gets you invested. It kind of subverts your expectations. But what I think the movie falls flat is that it really wastes the premise of the book, because I think the central premise of the novel and the film, of the idea of a Sphere you can enter, and then it gives you this power, which they call the power, to manifest whatever is in your mind. That's a great science fiction premise. I mean, it really is like a fascinating idea that you could take in like literally any direction. But I feel almost the way I did after watching the two great squandered premise Jim Carrey movies, The Truman Show and Bruce Almighty. You have this classic premise and then you sort of don't do anything with it. It's sort of like, where did you, Kirk is looking quizzical right now. But no, I just
We're
feel
gonna
like,
have to come back to your critique of The Truman Show. Okay, but Bruce Almighty, fine. But anyways, go ahead.
no, but I think that so you have this premise you can do basically anything with it. And part of it too is the fact that it really only comes out in the last like third or so of the movie, at which time there's just not that much time to explore this idea very far. But I kind of wish this movie was like 15 to 20 minutes longer, so we could really sit in that more and have more of like a vibe of like the movie I was thinking of was Annihilation. Like that's a movie that had the tone and the atmosphere I would want from this like premise. I understand it's a different kind of movie, a different kind of story, less pulpy, but I feel like this premise deserves that treatment. It deserves sort of more surreal imagery. You know, I liked at the very end, they tried to do some surrealism when they're going in the sub and they don't really know where they are and they're seeing these like visions, but it felt like just too little too late. I wanted to see three-headed men on fire on the ship. I wanted to see their moms yelling at them and crying. I wanted to see people turning blue like Paul Giamatti and Big Fat Liar. I wanted to see all that. And we didn't, you know, I just felt like we could have done so much more with this idea. And I also think too, that everything with that climax in that third act everything just feels so rushed. It just feels like the whole thing with the explosives, which in the book does feel a little bit of an ass pull, like, oh, we need some tension, we're gonna have these explosives. But in the book, they do a little bit of a better job explaining why Beth puts them there and like what she's thinking, and like so that when they do go off, it feels a little bit more earned. Whereas in this movie, it's just like, oh, suddenly there's a bomb and it's gonna go off and we got to get out of here because we need some tension. We can't just like sit with this for a minute. So on the whole, I was pretty mixed. There were things I liked, but I feel like I'm not ready to call this a lost classic. And to be clear, I don't think the book is like great. I think it's guilty of some of these same sins, but I think that the story is paced a little bit better and I think makes some narrative choices that work for me a little more. So that would be my main takeaway.
Great. Thank you, Tony. It's interesting to hear that the novel seems to take different turns and also that the adaptation adds certain elements like the backstory for the relationship between Norman and Beth, which I thought, you know, was just really like kind of blew me away a little bit to hear that. But it's interesting. I have a lot of thoughts about this movie. I think it's a fine film. I think it's all about your expectations for it. I do believe that the cast, you know, there were some complaints online about the idea that this cast was squandered. I don't think that's true. I really don't. I mean, sure, we weren't seeing, you know, Basic Instinct or Jackie Brown or Rain Man, but we were seeing good elements. I think really Dustin Hoffman brought the film together. He kind of humanized the characters. You know, he has that kind of unassuming, very personable manner, kind of self-deprecating almost at times, but then he had the edge of being a dick and having this really kind of vicious side to him in the film. So I thought that was interesting. And we kind of followed the film through his perspective, it seemed. But, you know, I think it's indicative of a greater, we think about what's missing in this film, right? We don't necessarily think about what's there. And I think it's indicative of the greater trust that creators have put in us, the audience. And I think you nailed it on the head, Anthony, is like the last kind of dialogue at the end, kind of explaining, tying the loose ends together, was rather unnecessary. And it kind of killed the drama of that, you know, was in the air, that, you know, was palpable. Whereas you look at a film like Annihilation, you look at a film like Arrival or Interstellar, right? Like all of these films can tolerate some nuance and ambiguity. Really, at the end of this film, we had Dustin Hoffman explaining to us what exactly had happened, why we weren't ready for it. You know, like that's basically up to the audience to do as they're driving home. And he did it for us. And I think that's a shame. But I think it's because in the late 90s, to spend $80 million on a film, you can't have Jane and Dick from Waterloo, Iowa going home confused, right? Like this film needs to feel concise. It needs to feel coherent and well shaped, right? So that's why I think this ultimately was a failure of the industry, or the constraints of the industry, I would say. But I do think there's stuff here, like Ted says in the film, well, it may be devoid of life, but we can still learn from it. Like, what can we learn from this film? Like, what does this film show us about the trajectory of sci-fi, the trajectory of the modern blockbuster? You know, maybe looking at how these ideas maybe are more niche now, we don't see just kind of this like ensemble cast almost in such a I would say adventurous plot for sure, at least maybe in children's films, but definitely not in like a thriller. So I'm interested to hear what your guys' thoughts are on that. But I will just say I do love how they use water. I think that sounds so stupid now that I just said that, but I'm a big fan of Titanic, and I'm a big fan of movies like Deep Blue Sea. And I love how the 90s had this fascination with like water seeping in and just soaking everything, these environments. And I really do love that aspect of it. And, it's obviously coming from like Poseidon Adventure and The Abyss and all these films. I thought there was something special there. I just love that it felt kind of off the wall compared to what I was watching at the time as like an 8-year-old when I saw this film. They didn't rely on like heavy nudity or copious amounts of gore. It seemed more cerebral. I didn't really understand what was going on, but I was intrigued. The visuals are pretty interesting. It doesn't necessarily look too dated. I think the score is excellent. And, I guess there's not too much to say. There's a lot of conventional things in this film, but I think it should be applauded for its premise, and it should be applauded for its acting, perhaps for its direction, though at times it felt a little sloppy, its ingenuity. But yeah, let's broaden the conversation now. Let's look at maybe some comparisons, how this movie falters in comparison to other films. Maybe we can talk about the fact that sci-fi in and of itself, like horror, seems to fall victim to the comparison game, right? Like, we don't necessarily do that with like romance or dramas that often, do we? But we want to typify things so often in sci-fi. So I'm just curious, there's a lot of different directions to go in. I'll let you guys choose what's most salient in your minds, and we'll go from there.
Okay. I have the lazy cultural historian take that Anthony was looking for. So in previous decades of science fiction, right, there's this about stuff about the right encountering the alien, the other, which may reflect us in some way, but it's just different enough from us that it can frighten us, or right, the fact that it is like us, may reveal something about ourselves, or we may learn something, right? I mean, there's a lot of sci-fi to go through. Obviously, it's a very rich tradition in the mid 20th century, but interesting that in the 90s, at this moment in time, right, the encounter with the other is only an encounter with ourselves. There's a sense of there's nothing else out there to be found. There's a sense of, if you will, the end of history. There's a sense of, if you will, the end of the frontier, right? Of nothing more to be explored, and that all that's left is to plumb our own selves. That we need to. There's a turning inward and a kind of narcissism to it, to put a negative spin on it. But I think obviously it also kind of encapsulates the time. But of course, it's just kind of a classic move, right? To turn, inward. And that's it. That's all I got.
Let me add. That's a good one, Connor, because now you got me thinking. Okay, I'll take my two examples I said at the beginning: The X-Files and Independence Day. Right, The X-Files at this time is one of the most popular TV shows in the U.S. at least. The movie comes out in '98. The whole idea, right, is there's a UFO hidden at the farthest reach of the Earth that we just barely penetrated, Antarctica, the last frontier besides space that they keep bringing up in that movie. But at the same time, there's still a belief, I think, that conspiracy could reach everything, particularly at the governmental level. And that is, to me, interesting because it's still a very cynical approach to sci-fi. But in movies, it's a more optimistic one in which we never see the alien. Independence Day, they come, but we never see the alien, if I remember right? They just blow up the UFO, and all is saved. Terminator 2, which I guess is about 9 years before, of course, is also about averting the apocalypse as we enter the 90s. And I feel like I got to come up with other 90s movies now to continue this.
You got Mars Attacks.
Mars Attacks, a parody, yes. A classic in its own right. But no, okay, I agree with Connor. I'm just throwing my examples in.
All right, that's great. The death of history, the end of history, or the end of the future, perhaps even, where humankind, we've sputtered to a stop. very kind of provocative. So, Tony, why don't we hear from you? What do you think ultimately? You're kind of an industry guy, right? Like you're kind of born and raised in this
My real name is Walter
environment.
Weinstein. My uncle, you've heard of him. He's
Henry, your uncle.
Yeah.
Yes, Henry, very famous, very good man. Yes. So, Tony, tell us a little bit. Where do you think there is anything in like to the idea of this film kind of being pulled in multiple different directions? Obviously, with the book being, its own thing, and trying to honor the book, trying to stay, have some true relation to the book and a resemblance, like a, facsimile of this, but also at the same time listening to kind of, who was this? Fox? I think this was Fox. Executive.
I think it was Warner Brothers.
Oh, it was Warner Brothers. Okay. So, you have to manage these different realities. I mean, where does the blame land for any sort of shortcomings, or,
well,
is it more systemic than that?
The movie's in kind of a weird place because like the movies we've mentioned and like the things you mentioned, I mean, I'll admit I have not watched the X-Files. It's a hole in my pop culture knowledge. I guess that would be, from what I know of it, that's probably the closest analog. But when I think of like things like Independence Day or Armageddon or whatever, or the 90s, kind of the movies that endured, the movies that did make a pop culture impact and were like big hits, because Independence Day, for instance, is a movie that people still talk about. It's a movie that people still watch. It's a movie that, many people have seen, and it's on TV all the time. It's just one of those movies that had like an impact. And, Armageddon, and maybe not to the same extent, but like, these are like what we think of when we think, I mean, maybe the timeline's not perfect, I don't know, but I'm thinking of like, this is what I think of when I think of this era, this general part, this area of sci-fi, mainstream, big budget sci-fi. And those are more like apocalyptic, large scale, like conflicts, which Sphere really is not. It's not like that. It is, at least in theory, more in the tradition of more, I hate to say cerebral, but more about the science, right? These are all scientist characters. Michael Crichton always writes about scientists, and they're kind of dealing with a problem in some interesting way, and things kind of spiral out of control. But the thing is, like, it's still like it's a mainstream like paperback novel you can like buy at the airport. It's very fast paced. It's very accessible. It's very like exciting and propulsive. So the movie's in kind of this weird place where it wants to be this, and you've got this big budget cast, so it wants to be this very like accessible kind of popcorn movie, but it lacks the spectacle of an Independence Day or or Roland Emmerich films. It lacks that level of spectacle. There is an explosion, but it feels very obligatory and half-assed at the very end of the movie. And almost felt as though like, all right, guys, there needs to be an explosion in this movie. Beth is like, all right, guys, like, what do you want me to do? Like, we gotta make our money somehow. I had to place the explosives. I don't know. So I don't really know. So I think that's probably why the movie failed, honestly, was just that, because it occupies a really awkward space. It's not quite cerebral enough, I think, to have like the cult following of a certain movie. Some of these movies fail initially, but are kind of rediscovered on DVD or whatever, like Fight Club, for instance. This doesn't have quite the stickiness or the, Barry Levinson doesn't have the panache or the audacity for that to really happen, So I think it's just in kind of an awkward place in film history. As far as the history of science fiction, I mean, I think it is sort of in that, man encounters aliens and finds himself falling short genre. That's the best way I can put it. But which has never been my favorite tradition of sci-fi, because it always felt very like self-congratulatory to me, because like whenever you're bemoaning how bad humans are in general, presumably you're exempting yourself. Like, I have a feeling Michael Crichton would think that if he were to encounter the sphere, he would be fine. But I don't know. But that's kind of a tangent. So yeah, so I think this movie was just a victim of being in kind of this awkward, and I don't know if there's a way they could have done it differently there where it could have been a hit. I think it's just the nature of the story does not lend itself to like blockbuster filmmaking, not just in the 90s, really at any time.
I have two solutions. The first solution is a lot more lens flare. We have nothing explained, no dialogue in the last 15 minutes of the film. And it gains a cult following. Oh, this is so masterful, true cinema. The other option is, due to the time, we have a tank full of Chechnyan freedom fighters come out of the sphere, and Dustin Hoffman has to fight them in, combat, close combat, machine guns. What do you guys think? I think that would have worked well.
Honestly, dude, if they had a scene like that, but with the power where they're manifesting like things like locusts and stuff, that'd be great. I would love that. If they'd gone ham, I think we could have had something, but they didn't go in that direction either. I think with this story, you either have to be super cerebral and slow paced, or you just go nuts. And this movie couldn't do either.
The same fate as Green Lantern, as Ryan Reynolds, we love it, but it ultimately fell short. It didn't commit. But I want to hear from
Hold on, Kirk. I have another.
Yes, Connor, you have a thought. Go ahead.
Dustin Hoffman makes love to the squid.
Interesting.
And the squid obviously it could be like a manifestation of his mother. Like, we could get weird with it. We might go crazy.
We might get a more global audience, if you know what I mean. Wink, wink. Certain
right.
subgenre of a certain type of cultural artifact.
But that might, introduce an element of the kind of global cinema to it. Yeah.
Or you just have Guillermo del Toro direct. He's into that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It even win Best Picture.
There's a lot of different directions. This film, it's kind of a case of fallen expectations and missed chances. Anthony, I want to hear from you the role of ambiguity, and you can take this wherever you want. But I was thinking independently of Tony of Arrival, and I thought, well, Arrival as well, but actually I was thinking of Annihilation, and how Annihilation does not hold your hand, especially towards the end of the film with the big reveal. I want to hear if anybody else has something to say on this, but how has this changed over the last 23 years? How have we evolved or devolved as a movie-going audience in terms of how we relate to science fiction, or maybe it's how we relate to thrillers or certain subtexts or tropes? Whatever you have to say, Anthony, if you're interested.
No, it's an interesting question, Kirk. I think I was also thinking of Annihilation when you and Tony were talking. I think what's interesting is sci-fi in particular as a genre, maybe besides horror, it threads that needle of wanting to comfort its audience with like everything or too much, and wanting to kind of pull things back. And I think of the ones that tend to be successful. I don't think there's necessarily a formula for it, but we just talked about Blade Runner, for instance, which has a literal history of making it more ambiguous by the time we get to 2004's The Final Cut, which, as we talked about then, renders a whole different movie entirely for the better, for the most part. And similarly, 2049, which tried to also pull that back. And a number of Denis Villeneuve's movies do that, but Blade Runner 2049, which tried to pull that and do something similar, and we saw that be kind of a moderate to somewhat of a failure in terms of box office numbers. So there is, like, I guess, kind of the difficulty of selling it off to a sort of larger audience that isn't already attuned to your ideas.
Connor, what do you think? Do you have any thoughts on that?
This is tough. I would say, to your question, Kirk, I would say that I don't know how true this is, but I think a more general audience is aware of the idea. And I think this is a big genre of the kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of psycho thriller, the kind of the element of, where we accept that there are hallucinations, or that there are things that are, projections of one of the characters, unconscious. We accept that with reading, as we watch, Lynch films and stuff. And I think obviously a certain set of film goers were definitely in the 80s and earlier were certainly attuned to that kind of thing. And it already occurred to people from the very beginning, obviously, with Dr. Mabuse and all that. But I think we're a little bit more sophisticated on that front, I would say. I hesitate, though, to say that that's the solution here, though. I think, like, ultimately to fix the movie, I think Tony is right that, like, kind of the premise and the way it falls in between these two kind of extremes is kind of the problem. But my instinct is not to say that making it more vague would make it better, because though I agree that sometimes exposition, is a vice, when you don't need it. And maybe there's a little bit too much towards the end there. I think the way just the movie sets itself up, it literally engages in kind of in what I would call misdirection, right? It literally wants to make you think. It literally sets up the shell of a certain kind of idea of this intelligence that we're communicating with through a computer. And then that shell kind of drops away to reveal another shell, beneath it, which is itself stripped away. So like the movie deals in these kind of like, it so clearly sets up that expectation such that if you were to make it somehow just simply more vague as it went on, I just don't think it would have worked. I'm okay with a movie being, especially with a sci-fi premise, I'm okay with a movie being fairly canny and fairly deliberate and explicit in its setup, especially when it wants to subvert those things. I think I appreciate that in a sense. I just think that in this case, when you get explicit and you get specific with how these powers work, for instance, then the audience starts to ask, more and more questions, such as, why aren't there, 3 Sharon Stones in the place at any one time? Why aren't they naked, right? Why is the squid always dropping eggs? What was that all about? These kinds of questions. Also, like, just sort of things of that nature. And I had a lot of those as I was watching. Oh, one of my favorites is just a nitpick. The fact that they mistranscribed the name of Jerry became Harry, in which case that would be very clear. Like, if you were to retranscribe it using that particular keyboard, it would be like, my name is, right? You see what I'm saying? Like this kind of thing.
So in the book that makes sense. In the movie, I'm not sure. So who solves the code? Is it Ted or Harry?
Ted.
Okay, Ted, so that doesn't make it because
Harry plugs in the he says now we just got to plug in the letters. So Harry actually does the one-to-one translation.
Okay, then that's why, because Harry's like
sabotaged it,
hiding it basically, or maybe not even aware of it that he's hiding it, but that's why it. Yeah.
Oh, wait, I have a question, though, to Connor's kind of idea. I'm just thinking, as a general question, would we be more willing to accept ambiguity and vagueness, perhaps, but more so when we deal with grander ideas, as opposed to, because particularly in the case of, like, Sphere, right? Like, what is the kind of general point to this movie, maybe? I mean, sure, we could all pull something out and argue there's a big idea or whatever, but really it seems to be, as Kirk was bringing up, the ending line about Dustin Hoffman saying none of us are prepared to meet an alien, or like we're all like, we're not ready for this. But if the movie was willing to accept the ambiguity of fear, the kind of difficulty of capturing that down, how surreal it is to each person, I wonder if we would perhaps be more susceptible to that. But at the same time, in giving us answers, it ruins, I think, potential maybe for having a sort of more grand statement. I don't know if that's quite the word, but maybe a larger argument about the kind of condition that sci-fi especially likes to answer or pose.
I think that's fair, Anthony. I mean, we look at like applicability, right? How is this applicable to my own life? And it's not entirely clear, because it's like, okay, well, if I meet an alien, I won't necessarily be ready to talk with them. Like, we're talking about kind of the fraught nature of humanity and our how we're overcome by our vices or our fears and our complexes. So it's a little vague in that respect. Whereas, there's not a big call to action like in other films. It doesn't necessarily transcend or translate to our everyday lives, right? And so it is more kind of like a thought experiment. Like, it's the hypothetical, the quotation marks are very explicit, right? And it's like, this is where it ends. And I think maybe that's why the exposition was so there at the end, so visible, but I'm not sure,
Yeah, I
Tony,
don't
go ahead. You have a thought?
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I think this is a problem the book has too. I don't like Norman's like kind of editorializing at the end or summing up the themes, or like, well, we failed this test, like we weren't worthy of the power. But it's like, it's not like it wasn't like a moral failing. It's just like you're afraid of squid. Like, is that a bad thing? Like, is that so horrible? Like, of course, everyone's afraid of something. Like, it's like I guess it's our weakness, our frailty that's like, and I don't know. Like, to me, there's like something very like kind of not very well thought through about that. Like, which is why I think that like you're taking this premise that's infinitely expansive and you're putting it into the tiniest possible box. And I think that's why you can't apply it to anything else, is because like I guess I won't be afraid of squid from now on in case I find a magic sphere. You know, I don't know, like what yeah, like there's nothing to take away from it.
There is though, there is. And maybe this will be our last little bit before we go on to voting. But the idea of we can't change the future, time travel, the spaceship from the future flies through a black hole, flies through the singularity, and somehow arrives, as Ted says, in the Pacific Ocean 300 years ago. So is there something about the idea that our capacity for self-destruction, is that perhaps the idea that, you know, Harry says, oh, you know, we're all going to die down here. And I guess at the end, it's not true, right? Because we didn't fulfill that prophecy. We instead forgot. So I don't know. If there is meat on the bone, like if we're kind of consuming a chihuahua, we found a little like belly fat, right? Like that's where the meat is. It's not on the legs. It's not on the hind, you know, where is it? It's kind of there. So I don't know if anybody has any sort of cogent reading of the idea of like escaping or like fatalism, or I don't even know what it is. Whatever you want to say on that. And then any final thoughts before we go into the voting process, but let's hear it. Fair enough. That about sums up my understanding.
This chihuahua is picked clean, Kirk. No. Sorry, I had to think for a second. I mean, doesn't it feel kind of like the old, you know, and they sort of hint at this. It's the old Treasure of the Sierra Madre. It's like, you know, the fact that the crew members killed each other, right? The fact that we can't get along and our mutual suspicion. And that's kind of itself the way we project our own issues onto other people. And like, you know, we are each a sphere to each other in a way, right? That we like, people can manifest their dark thoughts onto us. I mean, that's never actually thematized, I think, directly in the movie, but I think there's definitely something there. There's something about being aware of our own, you know, of our own dark side in a way that I think the Norman character, I think at first isn't, you know, and he becomes a bit more forthcoming as time goes on. And he introspects, and it's kind of why he had to be a psychologist and kind of guide us through that, right? And that kind of, you know, like I said, it's not really about aliens in that case, or trying to prepare you for an encounter with, you know, some unbelievable power, but maybe sure, the idea of having power, right, means taking responsibility for one's own, you know, dark side, right?
Right. Maybe our need for drama, right? Our lust for drama that was manifested down in the ocean. You know, you can look at it from a Freudian perspective. Like why did our subconscious, why did we manifest only negative emotions? Like, is that an omission, or is that purposeful? Like, is that a purposeful take? Tony, you have a thought?
Well, I was gonna say that like in the book, actually, the movie doesn't address how you get in the sphere, but in the book it's established at the end that you just imagine the sphere opening. So it's like, if you can imagine the sphere opening, there must be some kind of pre-existing power, right? So, and they talk about like imagination, how humanity is unique because of the power of imagination. So maybe that's it. Maybe we all have the power. I don't know.
All right. So I think it's the idea, our own creativity may doom us, may lead us to, we're not practical enough. As Michael Crichton is saying, we have emotions, we have ideas. He wants us to be soulless automatons. Fair enough, Michael C. Anyways, let's go on to voting.
About squid, that's my problem.
Yo, you can only think about squid? Okay.
Just don't read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, or see Sphere, I guess.
Those are interchangeable, you know, cultural products as well. I think one should be taught more than the other in schools. Anyways, let's go on to voting. Let's see. Which no do I want to pick from first? I guess I'll go for Anthony. Anthony, you know, be nice.
All right. Well, let me just take a step back real quick. Final thought, because I heard a Lit 101 buzzword for me, Freudian. And I just want to say, in terms of the paradox at the end, so grand idea here, paradox, like, why do they have to manifest themselves forgetting? Why not make the effort to just deny the story or withhold the story? Do they really need to forget in order to placate the government? Like, like they're going to go down there, but like, if we know like what's going to happen, right? Like, wouldn't just making another decision still affect the future as it happens if the future's preset? Is my question. So is the movie then maybe suggesting that forgetting is sometimes better than just attempting to deny the future? Does that make sense? Maybe that's what I'm getting at here, and that goes along with my answer of no. But
I think forgetting is ultimately, it's a superpower, right? Like, we do not have that ability really to forget, at least consciously. I mean, I don't even know, that might be an oxymoron, but yeah, like it's the death rattle of the power, right? It's this supreme ability that we do not have. But anyways,
yeah.
So we have one no, all right, and then Connor.
Kirk, I won't say it's a tough choice. It's this movie was interesting to watch, and we got a very good, interesting conversation out of it. It's hard to sum up exactly what it is. I think I liked ultimately what Tony said about the kind of being between these two extremes of kind of the thoughtful, cerebral, and the sort of more actiony, thrillery type of thing. Interesting to compare too, right? To kind of, Crichton kind of ruled this decade in terms of like film adaptations. So many of his books were adapted, and fun to think about why. And then, somehow this movie is very much of its time in ways that we couldn't even get into, yet still, I think, quite distinct, in its ambition, to be a bit more thoughtful. But I'm going to have to give it a no, despite, right, like the impressive performances and like, pretty cool direction by Barry Levinson, also some pretty big movies. He's done a lot of movies, a lot of movies, but, made some interesting choices here. And, there's some cool moodiness, and the underwater sequences were cool. But I guess ultimately at the end of the day, it's kind of that script problem that holds it back.
Fair. I think we all were happy to watch it, though, or maybe even to discuss it. Maybe you didn't enjoy watching it, but anyways, Tony, did you enjoy watching it, and what's your answer?
I enjoyed watching it, just in the sense of like, I remember this. That was kind of like, that was mostly my experience of watching it. But no, the one thing I'll say, my one final note on Barry Levinson's direction is that the best thing he does that I think was kind of half baked, and I wish he'd leaned into more, were not the title cards themselves. Those were pretty unnecessary, but the way he edits out of the title cards in a kind of a disorienting way. Like, there's one where you get this, like, there's this siren and it's kind of confusing. It's out of nowhere. And Dustin Hoffman's waking up and he's running around, and there's this sort of this sense of disorientation and the sense of like, how did we get here? That is much more, and not to keep comparing it to the book, but I can't help it, but like, that's a much stronger feeling in the book. And I wish the movie had found a way to kind of like manifest that feeling a little more. And I think he could have like, emphasized that aspect of the story a little bit, maybe just, and I think even just doing that would have bumped it up for me a little bit. But we have the movie that we have. And, I have to say no. I did enjoy watching it. There were some interesting things. The performances were pretty good. I think it's an interesting kind of 90s time capsule, but it's not a movie that I'm probably going to watch again or recommend to others. So
I think you're right. You look at the sphere and you can imagine things. If only Dustin Hoffman had looked at the sphere, he had thought of the Philosopher's Stone, and then in his pocket, the Philosopher's Stone would have been, he could have killed Professor Quirrell. But anyways, that is our episode on Sphere. Thank you very much. Now we will head to the nomination process, where my three co-hosts for the week will nominate a movie for me to choose between. Nominate three movies for me to choose between, and that'll be the episode we watch, or the movie we watch for next week. So I believe, based on our rules, the person who went least recently gets to choose the order of nomination. And I believe it's Tony. Correct me if I'm wrong. It might be Anthony, but I think it's
Anthony, because we did Sorcerer last and Jackie Brown before that, which was me. So it has to be.
True.
Yeah,
okay,
then
Anthony.
been on a cold streak, but I'll go second. And Connor, do you want to go first, and then Tony last?
I can go first. That sounds good. Okay, Kirk, I've got something I hope you haven't seen. I imagine you might. It just feels like a Kirk movie to me. This is a kind of movie that I often, kind of forget about and return to as a classic period drama of the last century. Let's say this is 1988's Dangerous Liaisons, starring John Malkovich, adaptation of the legendary epistolary novel from 1782 by Laclos, I think is the name of the author. Not very well known, didn't write many other things, but kind of a classic of its type, about kind of the intrigues of aristocrats in 18th century Paris, about their cruelties to each other, their dissimulations, and kind of just famed as being just an intense sort of psychological portrait. All of this kind of backbiting and falsity and wicked manipulation of one of the other, kind of set against this beautiful backdrop of late 18th century France, with the most unimaginably, sort of, and very 80s, very opulent, kind of itself, kind of suits the time, right? The two decades, the 70s, 80s, and the 1980s kind of fall into one another, this kind of decadent opulence and this joy of wickedness. I think it's compelling, and I think you would respond to it a lot, Kirk.
Are you saying beheadings are in our near future? So that's pretty scary. But interesting.
Well, no beheadings in it. It's sort of this pre-revolutionary, but the novel was considered to be a big sort of inspiration for the French Revolution, and that it showed the foibles of the aristocracy.
Right. Okay. Dangerous Liaisons for Connor. Anthony, you wanted to go second. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I don't know if Connor has seen this movie. I think I remember arguing about it with Tony years ago in the dorm, but I could be misremembering. But the movie I'm picking is not based on a book. Tony needs a break. He's reading too much. It is Park Chan-wook's 2013 film, and as far as I know, the only English film he's done, Stoker, starring Anthony Fave, Mia Wasikowska, and Matthew Good. It's a sort of Hitchcockian style gothic thriller about this young woman whose sort of dad dies, and her mysterious uncle, comes into the house to kind of live with her and her mother, and she begins to have these kind of doubts and questions about him. But it's played and directed in this sort of brilliant Hitchcock / old boy style that I think is just thrilling. It's not necessarily an action film, more of a thriller, sort of gothic horror set of a tone, but it's just got this interesting, brilliant direction that I have never seen replicated elsewhere. Great performances and just very interesting sort of setup altogether. Also features, and I've heard other people agree with me on this, one of the sexiest non-sex scenes I've ever seen on film. And I'll leave it there.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, I would prefer sexiest sex scenes, but I'll take sexiest non-sex scenes too. Anyways, Tony, go ahead.
More than the pie scene in A Ghost Story, Anthony? I think not. I don't know. That's the first thing I thought of. All right. So I'm going to do what I've done a couple of times and give you a choice, Kirk. I have 3 certified bangers. I'm just going to list the year, so you don't know anything about these other than the year. 2003, 2011, 2020.
Okay, definitely not 2020. I feel like I've trended early 2000s recently, so I'll pick the 2011.
Okay, I feel like you may have seen this one. That's why I was more hesitant. But it is, I think, a Kirk. Or you've all seen it, but I think it's a Kirk movie for sure. Take Shelter, starring Michael Shannon. I watched not too long ago. Okay, so Michael Shannon plays a man in Ohio, the best state in our fine country, who is like a working class guy, and he is starting to have these visions and dreams that he suspects there's going to be a horrible apocalyptic storm that's going to like kill everybody. And he wants to like take drastic measures to protect his family. So it's a movie kind of about mental illness, question mark, right? Because I guess we don't know. Could it be real? Who knows? But he doesn't know because it's kind of from his perspective. Very realistic drama, very amazing performances. Jessica Chastain is in it as well. a beautiful movie about family, about mental illness, about trying to overcome your struggles in a human way. And it's got some incredible scenes, some amazing Michael Shannon's best performance, I think, bar none. I can't think of a movie that competes with it other than his Delocated episode, which is number 2. But yeah.
Boardwalk Empire is great, but maybe you haven't seen the series, so you wouldn't know.
I haven't seen it yet. It could be better. I don't know.
Yeah, he's a phenomenal actor, stage actor as well, I believe.
The greatest Michael Shannon performance was him walking into a coffee shop I used to work at and just standing at the counter, grabbing some napkins, wiping his face, throwing them away, and leaving. And doing this quite a few times over one summer.
Well, we have a bit to look forward to if I choose Tony. But anyways, time for some rebuttals. We have some movies with capital M. We have some good movies here. Connor, let's hear what you have to say. Maybe I do like to know if you've seen the other movies. So if each of you could do that when you rebut, that would be great. But go ahead.
Kirk, thank you. I have seen Take Shelter quite recently, and yeah, it's good. It's good. I would profit from a rewatch of it, but I wasn't wild, screaming mad about it. But it was interesting. Like I said, I think it's it's in the area of the psycho, drama, the kind of the is it real, is it not, kind of thing. I don't know. I can only take so much of that. I think it might be too similar to what we've just had. But as for Anthony's movie, I know nothing about it. I am only presuming that it is about Bram of Stoker fame, or perhaps in his allusion to Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula. And that's about all I can muster to Anthony's movie. As for mine, Kirk, I think you'll just really respond to it. We have a very young Uma Thurman appears in the film. There's some question as to her virtue is sort of imperiled over the course of the film by the by the machinations of the evil count played by John Malkovich. This could intrigue you, and I think but it'll have enough sort of psychology, and it just has the kind of you can imagine the sort of feeling it might inspire, the kind of hot damn, what are they up to this time? What's going to happen? Like, oh no, he didn't, it's kind of things. If that's what you feel like you might be in the mood for. I should also mention that if you've ever seen the movie Cruel Intentions is like kind of a teen movie remake of Dangerous Liaison. So if you have an interest in that, I personally like Dangerous Liaisons a lot more, but you can probably guess why that is. The kind of the period setting and all that I find really cool, and I think it's very well done. That's all I'll say.
All right, great. Go ahead, Anthony.
Sure. I think as for Take Shelter, I think when Connor gives a very lukewarm greeting about the movie, you got to kind of question the taste of what's being presented. And so I don't know if that's the movie we want to watch next week. I will say this. The only thing I know about Take Shelter, because I've never seen it, is it's been on my Hulu screen for the last 6 months. Shay and I have joked about watching it every single time we open Hulu, and just something about it, we just can't bring ourselves to do it. Maybe this would be the chance. Maybe there's a reason we haven't brought ourselves to do it, and not next week isn't the time to watch Take Shelter with Michael Shannon. But as for Connor's film, I do have an interest, I guess, in that period. I have a nostalgic love for Cruel Intentions for various reasons, which may make me kind of interested in Dangerous Liaisons. As for Stoker, though, I think the way I'd compare it and draw similarity to is not just because of the actress, not because of a supernatural reason, but Crimson Peak. I think if you're in the mood for something kind of haunted, something kind of absorbed in a sort of sexual kind of energy or kind of sexual interest, this is kind of the movie to watch. Like I said, Park Chan-wook directed it. So if you like Old Boy, Lady Vengeance or anything, not necessarily as gruesome, but certainly an energetic adrenaline type of filmmaking brought to the movie. At least I think so. And as for Connor, I will just add, has no major connection to Bram Stoker that I know of, but the lead character's name is India Stoker. I just feel like you could write a whole paper on that. So I'll leave it there.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Sounds like a YA character name, if I do say so myself. India Stoker fought against District 3 for her championship. Anyways, go ahead, Tony. They're ganging up on you. What do you have to say for yourself?
Sounds like we got a couple of pervs over here. Sounds like this movie should be called Stroker, how you're describing it, Anthony.
And dangerous lesbians. All right, we got
like Cousins Dangerous from Arrested Development. No, I've not seen Connors. I have seen Stoker, and I remember literally nothing about it. So maybe I'll see it again and I'll cry with its erotic beauty. I don't know. I kind of feel like I'd rather watch any other Park Chan-wook, but what do I know? I think my movie is squarely up your alley, Kirk. I know I've said that before. I've been wrong before. It's okay. I'm not perfect, but I feel like this is in your wheelhouse. I think it's a movie everyone, and especially since Anthony hasn't seen it, I kind of figured Anthony had seen it, so I'm eager for him to see it as well and get his take. I think it's a movie that kind of can speak to all of us in different ways. It's a movie that I saw that touched me, and that I feel like I will carry with me into the future. That it deals with some of these topics of of mental illness and like family in ways that I won't say I've never seen before, but in a way that felt very real to me. It felt very, very visceral to me. And there's a handful of sequences in this movie that I think are tremendously powerful in terms of performances. And as for it being too similar to Sphere, I don't know what Connor's smoking. That could not be further from the truth. It is nothing like Sphere.
Man, you guys came out aggressive. I mean, there have been some attacks here. It's making it a little difficult, to be honest. I was very high on all these movies, and now I'm a little bit apprehensive. So, have both of you seen Dangerous Liaisons? I missed that. I'm sorry. Anthony's not. Tony's not. Okay, interesting. And I know the other permutations. So, let's see here. It's tough. If this question was, what movie do you want to watch right now? Or what movie do you want to be the next movie you watch? It would probably be Tony's choice, right? Because that does sound like a movie I would enjoy. I like Michael Shannon. I like themes of mental illness and the schizophrenic nature of postmodern life. And I think that's really cool. You know, it's a cool subject to kind of dive into. But yeah, I think I don't want to be selfish here. I don't want to indulge. So I'm going to pass on Tony's film, even though I will give you credit for knowing what I like. So probably next time I probably will choose a Tony film or a Kirk film, whatever. But so this is a tough one between Connor and Anthony's. And I was leaning toward Anthony's until Tony said he doesn't remember anything from Anthony's film. Anthony, do you have anything quickly? I'm adding in a double rebuttal. You know, that's a personal attack. What was he doing during the film? Was he stroking or what was he doing?
I think that was around the time Tony got introduced to Tinder, Bumble, and NYU dating. So I'll leave it there. I will say the very same themes that Tony used to describe his film, I feel like you could just throw out mine too. Kind of vague gestures, but I think are there. So I'm surprised you don't remember it, Tony.
So this might come down to Mia Wasikowska versus Tarantino's Muse. So usually I choose the historical drama that Connor offers because I like learning about new cultures. I think I choose a lot of Connor films, to be honest, on the whole. And I think Anthony's underrepresented. So I'm going to choose Anthony's film here. I'm going to choose Stoker. It sounds almost like a film that Tony would have nominated. So I'm interested to see why it didn't land with Tony. Halloween is coming up. This will be a nice primer in terms of, mood, in terms of atmosphere. So we'll see how it goes. It should be fun. And I know Anthony's a great host, so we'll look forward to seeing Stoker, no relation to Bram. Next time you tune in to the 706. But in the meantime, our parting words, Anthony, please take it away.
I'll have what she's having.
I'm stoked.